very much indeed for that really generous introduction, and I wanted to thank Fraser as well for inviting me to give this talk. It's something of the graveyard slot after a wonderful day. So I quite honestly thought there wouldn't be anyone here, because I think if it was me, I probably would have gone to bed or something else. So thank you for coming, and I hope that I will do my best to keep you awake. I'm also going to describe a few experiences, because I think telling stories and narratives is sometimes easier to absorb after such a heavy meal than densely technical information. Although I will be drawing on some of that as well as we go through. And one of the issues that struck me when I started looking into this was how complicated it is, and we've already had a really fascinating talk before supper that talked about the complicated interactions in social, emotional, cognitive factors when it comes to religious belief and practice. But the evolution of religion is going back deep into history is even more difficult. And so rather than covering absolutely everything to do with that, I'm going to focus on two particular aspects. One is, why do we believe at all? So in a sense, if you don't know the answer to that question, you're not going to answer the question, why do we believe in a religious way? So why do we believe, and how did that start? The other one is, what are the emotive or affective accounts which we might want to present when it comes to thinking about the evolution of religion? Is it an account of fear, as some evolutionary thinkers think, punishing God, or is it something else? And I'd like to suggest that although fear cannot be ruled out in many contexts, the affective part, the positive attraction, if you like, is equally important, and it's something we need to explore and investigate, however challenging or difficult that might be. And I want to sort of flag up right from the start the collaboration that I've had for a number of years, since about 2011, with Agustin Fuentes. He's trained as a zoologist, but he's also an anthropologist. And right from the very beginning, or even before my appointment at Notre Dame, we started talking and discussing shared interests. And I still remember the day of my interview at Notre Dame. I met Agustin in his capacity as the director of a research institute designed to support those in the liberal arts at Notre Dame. And instead of talking about that, we went into all sorts of interesting discussions about the possibility of the evolution of religion and how you might investigate it. So after that experience, I thought, well, maybe Notre Dame wouldn't be such a bad place to come after all. So I partly blame him on me deciding to take that position. But more seriously, as time went on, we found we had a number of other interesting collaborations together, not least one where Rich Sostis, who's here as well, I don't know if he's here in the audience, there he is, was there at Princeton Princeton Center for Theological Inquiry, and that was on human nature and evolution. And Dominic Johnson, who was also there as well, who's based in Oxford, is somebody who I'm going to engage with in this lecture. So these kinds of discussions go back quite a long way for a number of years. But the question of why we believe is something that Augustine had asked in his Gifford lectures that he presented last year, and I like to think that perhaps I might have had a very small influence in the way he chose to frame those particular lectures. Certainly as an experience working as a theologian with an anthropologist, although we came from very different kinds of beliefs, we had a huge respect for one another and were able to accommodate that. But at the same time, what about religious experience? It may seem that those who believe are slightly strange creatures from those, according to those who are not believers. At the same time, they bring meaning, and they are true to those who are on the inside, as it were, rather than the outside. And I'm going to share with you a story about a trip to Ireland recently. Given that this is an after-dinner talk, because when we went there, it was a conference on religion and ecology. We had a tour of Ardmore Bay, and what was really fascinating in that very wet and soggy trip, where it rained, it was torrential rain, and the guide said he'd never known rain like that, even in Ireland, so it was really quite something. Which is why I'm showing you this slide, which is one from the web rather than my own photograph. Was that some of the beliefs around saints in that particular place have persisted. And as I said, he told the story about Declan was supposedly the first saint to arrive in Ireland prior to St. Patrick, in the 5th century. And he left Wales on a ship, and supposedly, while he was on this ship, he remembered that he'd forgotten his bell that he normally used to celebrate Mass. And so he was praying for the safety of his bell, rather than the safety of himself. And while he was praying, suddenly a rock appeared with a bell on it, and he was able then to take this bell to Ireland. But what he said was, "Where that rock lands will be the place of my resurrection." And lo and behold, this is the rock, St. Declan's Rock on Ardmore Bay. And you'll notice, I'll get this to work, a gap here. And what happens is that pilgrims for centuries crawled through that rock if they were sick, and they were miraculously healed, or at least some of them were. Now, the interesting thing about this is that although it had been a place of pilgrimage for centuries, the guide told us that the rock no longer attracted people in the same way anymore. And when someone asked, they're all religious studies scholars, mostly rather than theologians, they said, "Well, why is that?" And he said, "Well, we now know better. We're educated not to believe anymore." However, it was something of a paradox, because, and there's just an example of why the site is still recognised. It was a paradox because here is St. Declan's Well, the place where he went for pilgrimage himself towards the end of his life and spent his final days there. But on the 24th of July every year is his feast day. And rather than not being ignored as Declan's Rock is ignored, every year hundreds, or at least a large group at least, come to that place and hold a vigil, a candlelit vigil. One particular individual, a nun who's now aged about 90, sits beside that well every year, all night. And she says she does that because one day St. Declan will rise as the morning sun rises and greet her. And this continues. So the question then is, why do some beliefs persist and others not? Why do we believe at all? Why is it that these kinds of things continue, even though, rationally speaking, we might think, well, we don't really necessarily have a place for that kind of practice? And so this is the topic of, well, not that particular issue, but this is what Augustin Fuentes explores in his different lectures, which are about to come out in September. So I'm giving a plug for someone else's book rather than my own, in this year with Yale University Press. And I'm going to start with a definition of what belief means according to Fuentes. This is what he says. Belief is the ability to draw on our range of cognitive and social resources, our histories and experiences, and combine them with our imagination. Belief is the power to think beyond the here and now, and develop the mental representation in order to see and feel and know something, a thought, a vision, a necessity, a possibility, a truth. To believe is to utterly invest, wholly and authentically, in that something, such that it is one's reality. So, belief then is like an agent in the evolutionary process. It's not just something that's there cognitively, or it's very similar to what we just heard before dinner, that it affects all of us in every aspect of our lives. It shapes and structures and alters our daily life, the societies around us, and even the world in which we live. It's not then envisaged as a random process, this ability to believe, nor is it envisaged as some sort of divine intervention. Both are simplistic and wrong, and I would agree with Fuentes that he's correct in that assumption. But then how do humans come to believe at all? How is it that we have that capacity? And this is where I prefer to say, how do we have the capacity to believe? So it's not the content of the belief, it's the capacity to believe. And he believes that that capacity, as that quote I've just suggested to you implies, that capacity is tied up with our capacity for imagination, creativity, and dreaming, all those three together. And imaginative capacity also brings meaning, and it may allow us to hope in situations which seem hopeless, like maybe the political situation in the UK at the moment. But it's just as significant as bones, genes, and ecologies. And this is where I find it really fascinating as a theologian, that those aspects of our lives which bring meaning and draw on our imaginative capacities are as significant in evolutionary terms, in terms of the evolution of humanity or the evolution of the human, as all those other things which traditionally form part of the archaeological record. So let's look at some of the different facets in the capacity to believe, because again, it's extremely complex. And one of the main facets, which is one that ties in with this conference, is sociality. And it applies, of course, to other species as well, like cetaceans, so that's dolphins or whales, or canids, that's wolves or dogs. But it's the intense and extended mother-infant bond and the long lifespan, as well as diverse personalities and a particular anatomy that mark out primates in particular as distinct. So that particular sociality. And so Fuentes says this: we are part of a lineage that is social to the core. And it leads to both behavioural flexibility eventually and heightened social cognition. Also, what's really fascinating is that when you start to research macaques, which Fuentes has done, and this also applies to some other primates as well, you get some anecdotal evidence that they are able to experience something like our experiences of wonder or awe. So that aesthetic sense in primates came from an experiment. We came indirectly from an experiment where cameras were attached around the necks of macaques. It was a National Geographic funded project that Fuentes was involved in, and the idea was that it was to help study the behaviour of macaques in Gibraltar. And what happened was, on several occasions, not every occasion, but on some occasions at least, there were macaques that stopped in situations which we would find awesome to behold. And there was one really graphic example of a male who traversed over a walkway on top of a kind of motorway, and there was several streams of traffic that you could see as they turned towards the traffic stream. So they were walking across this walkway, and the target, or what they imagined the target at least, was a fig tree full of figs. And if you don't know much about the cats, you know that they absolutely love figs. So the question is, why would they suddenly stop and wait when the normal behaviour would be to rush across and eat as many as they possibly could consume? And in this case, the only sort of explanation that had any possible reason was that the view that was taken when they stopped and waited was absolutely stunning. So there was no other real explanation as to why they would wait. In another case, there was a female who stayed on this on the western face of a rock and looked out. And this was in a very busy day when they were foraging and feeding and caring for their young. And then suddenly there was this well, you can only describe it as primate contemplation of some sort. They just waited, and then they turned, and another framing was before them, and basically the observers of this were awestruck themselves when they saw this new frame, and that new frame is one that forms the cover of our book, The Evolution of Wisdom. So really, the credit should go to Celia the macaque rather than to Augustine Fuentes. So thank you, Sylvia, for taking that and helping us in our book. But Jane Goodall has found other examples of primates, or in her case, chimpanzees before waterfalls, and just stopping and looking. Again, these are very anecdotal. I don't think there hasn't been any recorded sign of preferences, so it's sporadic, but it's not random. And I think this is the kind of thing that Franz Abal found as well. He found these sporadic things, but eventually he did the experiments to show that it was there. But you wouldn't necessarily expect it to be as developed as it is in human species. At the same time, in pointing out these lines of continuity, I don't want to give the impression that I think that there was just a continuity with apes and other primates, not least because of the fact that they diverged 8 billion years ago from the last common ancestor, between 8 and 10 billion years ago. There are distinctive aspects of the human, like the fact that we've moved into bipedal activity from quadrupedal, and that is critical to our own cultures. We have different hand movements, we have different kinds of bodies, we have the possibility of new forms of communion and communication with one another in a way that primates do not. And at the same time, which particular hominins were the ancestors of us is still somewhat ambiguous. So there's a whole cluster of different hominins, and I'm not going to go through all the different examples today, except to say that as far back as Australopithecus, 3 million years ago, Australopithecines here, they started making stone tools, and so certainly Fuentes argues that our human niche also includes the social world just as much as the material world. Terry Deacon says this as well, that the human niche is a great ubiquitous semiotic ecosystem in which we develop. So this idea of a kind of complex ecology in which we gradually unfold. And Fuentes says this again. Our lineage developed from a group of fangless, clawless, naked, bipedal, ape-like hominins to be makers of stone tools, the controllers of fire, and the producers of cave art, and beyond to become constructors of towns, cities and empires, ultimately becoming the principal force in the global ecosystem. But after a 6 or 7 million year run with great diversity, we are the last hominin left standing. It's an absolutely awesome thought if you start thinking about that. Many people who are thinking about Homo sapiens as well believe that we moved from anatomically modern to behaviourally modern humans. However, that date keeps shifting back. Started off at 100,000 years ago, now it's more like 300,000 years ago. So Fuentes isn't necessarily convinced that that way of framing the problem is very constructive. The idea that we are symbolic has been very dominant in the discussion through Terry Deacon's work with symbolic species. But at the same time, that ability to make or to symbolize is rather more complicated than just arriving in its fully fledged form. So you can use or look at different artifacts in order to track the sort of cognitive shifts that are taking place, and search for as I said, to search for a linchpin or a sudden movement is likely to be misguided. In addition to that, there is another complication that's come to the surface, and that's this: Homo naledi. They found John Hawkes and Lee Berger were the main scholars involved in this, and they found the remains of these remarkable hominins very, very deep in the Star Cave complex in South Africa, in the Rising Star Cave complex. And what is absolutely astonishing is that these are some of the most intact skeletons that have ever been discovered. And they were buried really down these enormously deep, almost inaccessible shafts. So there's no way that they could have just got there by some sort of accident or somebody dropping them down. They were laid out sort of in an ordered kind of way, extremely well preserved, and very, very deep in this cave. And they were discovered almost by accident. And these hominin species, and again, the discovery of their date was only announced a few years ago. They were thought originally to be about around several million years ago, because they had many of the features of Australopithecines, but also some of the features of Homo sapiens in terms of their anatomy. But they lived between 300,000 and 400,000 years ago, so they were coincident with Homo sapiens. So Lee Berger makes the suggestion, informally, I don't know when he's published this, that some of the discoveries that have at some stage been attributed to Homo sapiens may actually have been Homo naledi instead. We don't necessarily know, unless there's particular bones that are around, but even then, if some of them are very analogous to Homo sapiens, it becomes much, much more complicated to tell. So it implies at least a gradual change rather than a sudden cognitive shift. And what's really interesting is that the cranial capacity of Homo naledi is actually quite small. Here we are. Oops. That's Homo naledi there. So it's interesting that they were capable of these deep burials. It's really, it sort of blows your mind a bit, because the standard narrative is that our brains have got bigger and bigger, and along come all these more sophisticated capacities, including sensitivity to death and so on. But actually it's not quite as simple as that anymore. Something maybe needs to change. Again, this graph is one that Mark Kissel developed while he was working on the Human Distinctiveness project with Agustin Fuentes. He's an anthropologist, and he's now got a position himself. But this was the work he did as a postdoctoral fellow. And again, what used to be uniquely human markers go back deep into history. So the earliest bone technology was found about 700,000 years ago. The earliest engraved lines, 650,000, and then earliest blades and so on. So, and it seems to come and go. It's not all at once. So this was the line now where we think is the shift between anatomically and cognitively modern humans, but what does that mean anymore when you have all these other things going on? Yeah, so that's where it used to be, and now it's over here, so it's kind of moved. So it's becoming more and more complex, and I'm not going to try and explain what it is, except to say that becoming human is probably far more like a network than a simple linear kind of process. So remarkably similar to what we heard about the brain, something similar is happening, well not similar, but it's related. Following the very unpromising beginning of early hominins, there was a ratcheting up of change. And certainly the last, from 14,000 years ago, things started to escalate with the exponential changes happening in the last 300 years. So because they've been happening so quickly in our recent history, we tend to think, well, things must have been fairly solid at the beginning, but actually they were far more sporadic than that and rather unusual in terms of what we were able to do. And again, some of those artifacts here, they don't necessarily identify them with particular hominid species, but in many cases they have been identified where they are associated with remains. Stone tools then, dietary expansion, social learning and enhanced cooperation, as well as a flexible social system, all these things kind of coalesced. And in addition, our extended childhood was probably really important, as well as cooperative caretaking, in order to allow these kinds of changes eventually to take hold. Many argue now that the making of stone tools, which actually is really, really difficult to do, led to novel connectivities in the brain, so very much in line with what we just heard. And that allowed that brain to be language ready. But also, and critically, I believe, the expansion in the capacity to show compassion and care for the infirm and care for the elderly, also in the long term and not just in the short term, those who were injured, is a critical part of our evolutionary history. So it's not just about stone tools and artifacts, it's also about our ability to care for one another. And Penny Spikins has done a tremendous amount of work in this area on the evolution of our capacity for different emotions. And so the capacity to believe then is likely to be embedded in our biological and our cultural aspects of our human becoming, rather than simply isolated or some sort of epiphenomenon. In addition, humans can add the transcendental relations to social interactions, leading to novel and also novel transcendent realities for those involved. So the emergence then of a religion-ready brain or mind. Although no one, I don't think, uses that term, what is it that allowed us to be religion-ready as well as language-ready? Could we possibly use that term or not? I'm inventing that, that's not coming from Fuentes. So Fuentes wants to explore why we believe, not what we believe. And I think that means it's more compatible, at least from a theological point of view, because he's not trying to say that what we believe has evolved in a particular way, but try and understand why it is that we believe anything at all. He also thinks that efforts by evolutionary biologists to explain the latter, that is, precisely what we believe, is likely to be misguided. We can track how religious belief could be understood, but the big question is, why did religious belief come to the surface at all? Charles Sanders Peirce, who's done and I know a number of you have done other work in this area, his trilogy of concepts helps us to unpack some of that complexity. So the symbol and the icon and the index way of thinking about the world means that we can understand that these things didn't happen all at once, but were gradual and sporadic. So an index is about a concrete reality. An icon is where there's some relation with what we're thinking about, whereas symbol has no specific relation. And if we see these as a sort of clustering and emerging, then it makes it clearer really how it could have arisen. Quali-sign, which is the quality of something like the blueness of blue, the blueness of the chairs we see in front of us. Or sin sign, that's the facts which are meaningful for us, such as a wind vane would be a sin sign. Ledger signs are just conventions. So all these different trilogy of categories by Peirce is, I think, a good way of trying to unpack how these different things could come into being. And I think nothing that I've said today is incompatible with a theological view of the world. At the same time, evolutionary anthropologists want to explore why humans have the capacity to believe in a religious sense. So, is Homo naledi made in the image of God? I'm not sure that's a fruitful question to ask, but I do think that religious becoming has been a long and tortuous and erratic process, and in that I would agree with Augustine. But at the same time, I want to say that the evolutionary anthropological framing of this problem is one way of understanding meaning and what it means to be human, but not the only way. Theology is something of an alternative. It asks not just where do we come from, but where can God be found? And that's not something that evolutionary anthropologists will deal with in the same kind of way. So it's the experience of God and not just understanding how God could have arisen in the imagination. So not just the creation of gods from imagination, but encounter with God. That's something that theologians are interested in. Evolutionary biologists to date have often been drawn to the idea of big gods. God is watching you, or maybe punishing you if you go wrong. And that, if you like, helps big cooperative societies to develop. But why would such a God be attractive? There must be other facets as well, especially early on in very small communities where that idea of watching you isn't necessarily going to be relevant, because those communities will know perfectly well what everyone else is doing, because they're small enough to tell. And so the point is that the inclination for punishment when the religious frame is used could also be explained by enhanced sensitivity to unfairness. So in those situations where a particular religious framing has led to punitive outcomes in terms of psychological and other tests, might also be explained by sensitivity to unfairness. And I'm citing here some work by Harvey Whitehouse, who's challenged the punishing God hypothesis in some aspects. So certainly, theologically, God is quite capable of being perceived as a punisher, that is to be feared, but also in a primary sense as a giver. So what are those primary emotions then that are associated with this idea of God being a giver? And I would say it's the positive emotion of gratitude. And here I'm going to touch on a collaborative project with Penny Spikins that we've started, and we're fortunate indeed to have Paris Wiseman, who's at the back here, to be one of the postdoctoral research associates with us. So we're well placed to push this forward in the next few years. The psychology of well-being and so on has taken up this idea of the importance of gratitude, but it hasn't really been explored yet in terms of its evolution. Of course, it is difficult to explore the evolution of gratitude, just as it's difficult to explore the evolution of compassion and some of these other associated emotions, but it's not impossible. There are clues, if you will, in the record that might help us. It's also common across, not just in the Christian tradition, but it's also common across many religious traditions, the importance of gratitude. I'm going to refer to briefly to Thomas Aquinas' view, but that's not to say that it's not possible to look at this from other religious traditions as well. In Aquinas, the virtue of gratitude is allied to justice, and according to him, it's about right relations, and the purpose of thanks is repayment, but it's not in any way a sense of direct repayment that's sufficient for the gift that's been given. So there's a debt of honour rather than the sense that you're paying back, because it's not a payback, but it's some kind of gesture, if you like. It preserves friendship for those who are innocent, but it also helps those who are forgiven. So those who have been forgiven have a huge sense of gratitude. And compassion and gratitude are both related to the virtue of charity. The ability to love one another is conditional on this ability to show gratitude. The second, and let's just say these are very brief, but the second example I want to give is that from Ignatius of Loyola, who's been, what many of you may, I'm sure, know that he was the founder of the Jesuits, which has had an enormous influence across the world. And the focus in the examen, which he believed was the most important prayer anyone could do every day, was to look back over the day, examination of conscience. And the first thing you did in this examen is to give thanks to God for the favours received. So the focus was on then positive inner emotions. Humanity is created to praise, reverence and serve God. He says this in a letter to Simon Rodriguez on March the 18th, 1542. He says this: "Ingratitude is one of the things most worthy of detestation before our Creator and Lord. Out of all the sins and evils which can be imagined." So he says that ingratitude is the worst possible sin, for it is a failure to recognise the good things, the graces and the gifts received. As such, it is the cause, beginning, and origin of all evils and sins. On the contrary, recognition and gratitude for the good things and gifts received is greatly loved and esteemed both in heaven and on earth. You can't have it much stronger than that in terms of linking gratitude with religion. Tim Gallagher says this: "It would be difficult to express more strongly a sense of the incomparable value of gratitude, that is, in Ignatian thinking." So the primary relationship between God and the believer is that of love, but the primary relationship between the believer and God is gratitude. And that then leads to greater acts of sacrifice and obedience, because you're grateful to the one who's given you everything. And the project that we are going to be doing is to say, where did this capacity show up in the evolutionary record? We need to distinguish it then from reciprocity in primates, but it's certainly not necessarily disconnected to it. And there are a number of different puzzles that we're going to try and tease out. First of all, the inherited cognitive basis of gratitude, and they all need investigating at once, which makes this very difficult to do. Where gratitude is situated in biocultural dynamics, What are the selective pressures influencing a capacity for gratitude? And how does gratitude, and this is a tricky one, affect the material record? And what patterns already exist? These are all unknowns. So I'm opening up to you this sense of a huge unknown that we're starting to try and explore. Certainly the networks of large-scale support are important in upper Paleolithic Europe. And this is one example of how early this is likely to have gone. 78,000 years ago, these artifacts, the ostrich eggshell and the conus shell bead, and this shell bead, these here, suggest that networks of gift-giving and the alliances have emerged by this time, and this, I credit this to Penny Spikins. In fact, all the evolutionary aspects are from here, from her, in the remaining couple of slides. Although the next one is one coming out of my own experience. For 1 year, between 2009 and 10, I was seconded to work with CAPOL, the Catholic Fund for Overseas Development, as it was then called, to develop a project on climate change and climate justice. And one of the things that we did, is I went with another colleague to visit the Maasai tribe, who had been given a distillation unit to distill steam coming out of the volcanic rock where they were living, in order to give them pure water, because all their animals were dying and they had no clean water. But after this distillation unit had been established, suddenly pure water was free flowing. And the first thing that you notice when you meet this community was their intense sense of gratitude, both to us but also to one another. And they gave us gifts as well. So here are some of the gifts that they shared. And their whole lives seemed to be wrapped up in gift giving and gratitude in a very, very palpable sense. So what I'm saying is that it's still very obvious in some of these communities around the world that how important gift giving is. Although articulating that gratitude is something that hasn't necessarily been explored all that much, although we are going to be collaborating with a number of those working in this area in order to find out more. What Spikins believes is that there was a general unspecific gratefulness first, and then gradually gratitude is directed to more specific individuals. So it didn't happen all at once, but there was this gradual change. And this is where it connects a little bit as well with this idea of social bonding that we're going to hear more about from Robin Dunbar tomorrow morning. So a kind of lead-in slide to his talk, although he's not here. But this isn't from him, this is actually from our grant proposal. So don't take any images of this slide. Although we have got the grant, so I suppose certainly this is the late Pliocene here. Chimpanzee kind of relationships, fish infusion models, raw material movements, peer-to-peer reciprocity. Gradually you go into the early Pleistocene, bonds between the whole group, and so on. And then eventually we get to the late Pleistocene, where the socio-emotional structure becomes more complex. So, and it's moving from here that we find the possibility of something like gratitude is likely to occur. So you can, by tracking movements and materials, actually work out whether it's likely to be there or not, because certainly some form of complex socio-emotional grouping is needed before you get the possibility you're going to have gratitude as a way of cementing that. So it's about our emotive lives as well as our cognitive lives. And that again is reinforced by the talk we just heard, so I don't need to necessarily stress that. So just a few working conclusions then, which I'll read out. Certainly the evolution of capacity for belief is the context for religious belief. So we have to try and understand why we believe in order to understand why we believe religiously. Primates have a capacity for sociality and reciprocity. They don't have the capacity to believe in the way humans believe, nor do they have the capacity for gratitude. Sociality is a key framework in the development of explicitly proven forms of transcendent consciousness. So the trick is to think, how do we move between these and how do we try and understand them? Biocultural evolution of distinctly human capacities is a complex and sporadic process over millennia. Theology need not resist evolutionary accounts that respect the embedded nature of beliefs. So it's about trying to understand why it is we believe, and I don't think that's a problem for theologians. Theological explanations cannot be tested by science, I don't think, but they're an important ingredient in understanding religious experience. And that's what we hope is going to happen in this collaborative group, that the philosophical and theological aspects can prompt, or if you like, stimulate asking scientific questions in a rather different way. So this is where the engagement between theology and science becomes, I think, creative and interesting, is when both start to change in ways that they hadn't expected. Oops, sorry. Gratitude is core to human experience and may be an overall cultural evolution of the capacity for emotive commitment to transcending others. So in other words, what I'm hinting at is the possibility that maybe gratitude is a prerequisite for religious belief. I'm not saying that it's necessarily directly related, because we haven't got any kind of evidence for that, but it's just as likely to be important as this idea of a punishing God. And then finally, gratitude is common to numerous religious traditions, and not just the Christian religious tradition. I'm not going to go into any of that. That's for other religious studies or other scholars to do. But just to flag that up and say that this is something that's of interest across the board when we're thinking about religious experience. And with that, so thank you very much for keeping awake and listening.
Celia, I presume you will kindly take sort of, up to 20 minutes of comments, questions.
Yeah. Yes.
You said that chimpanzees don't feel gratitude. How do we know that? I mean, because normally we would express it linguistically, but when my cat growing up brought us presents of food, how do I know that wasn't expressing some sort of gratitude?
Yeah, well, it's reciprocity, I think, is the key. So, but reciprocity is different from internal emotions of gratitude, and I think certainly if you ask someone like Franz Abal, for example, he would be very, very hesitant even talking about justice. So fairness or inequity aversion is very strong. But the point of animal behavioural studies is you don't make statements or conclusions without observational evidence. And I think in the case of cats and other primates, we might feel like they show gratitude, but that's a kind of anthropomorphism rather than something that's solid, as it were, based on the evidential basis of what they're doing.
I guess people used to make those kinds of comments about animal suffering, and now we wouldn't accept that. So how do you?
Yeah, well, this is one of the puzzles that we're going to try and work out, is the distinction between reciprocity and gratitude. And it may well be that we'll find that they're impossible to distinguish. And if they are, then we'll have to revise what we're claiming. But certainly Penny Spikins thinks that gratitude is a uniquely human capacity, and that it only comes when you have different kinds of forms of sociality that allows us to, if you like, abstract the idea of giving thanks and deliberately give that, whereas in the animal world it's much more sort of short-term, instantaneous type reaction. It's the same with compassion. There is a form of compassion in primates that is very short-term. It may be that you know, fleeting examples of reciprocity are you could call them gratitude in inverted commas, or something that's analogous, but it's not going to have the same kinds of movement, as it were, as full blown. And I think that again, it's about trying to juggle where you draw the lines and what they mean, and it also will depend on your definition of gratitude as well, as to whether, and it's the same with morality too. I mean, I've argued for some time that other animals have a form of morality, that it's not identical to human morality, and this is where the confusion sometimes comes in. So it's how you define what it is will affect which species or what that is. But with the hominin case, it becomes more complex, because you find these movements of gradually expanding groups of people where the potential for cementing those relationships over the long term and over distances, it becomes more and more significant then to have this more sustained sense of compassion and gratitude. So, but again, this is very, very new. We haven't started it yet. We're going to explore that interrelation. We're also very interested in exploring what's happening in other primate societies as well, although we're not going to be doing that research in the pilot project. It will form part of the wider, bigger project that we hope to get funding for. So we're not ignoring, that. It's just it's our hypothesis at least is that it's very distinct in the human species in when you get to a certain level of complexity. We go back to that earlier diagram and see what.
I wonder if you might be looking at the relationship with narcissism, because narcissism is something that inhibits forgiveness, and also some people would say the defining characteristic of narcissism is a sense of entitlement, which is antithetical to gratitude.
Yeah.
And you can get narcissistic individuals, but it seems to me that also you can get narcissistic communities from which,
yes,
almost by definition, gratitude is absent.
Yeah.
And I wondered if you had any thoughts about the conditions for the flourishing of gratitude in the community versus the absence of gratitude.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've taken a bit of a risk by telling you about something that hasn't started yet, which is probably an understatement, because it connects so well with this idea of the social brain. We haven't even begun to think about, the blocks to what gratitude might look like, and how we would even do the research on that. It may also come later in the process as well. So in other words, one of the things we probably want to do is look at hunter-gatherer societies and their patterns of social life, and see whether there are any narcissistic tendencies there or not, or what. So it's mapping these things that's sometimes difficult, because there could be some unspoken forms of gratitude even with the Neanderthals, for example, rather than ones where they have gift-giving. So there might be other ways of expressing it, rather like Bethany has just suggested for animals. Maybe there's a gift-giving is something which happens in our species, but maybe in the Neanderthals they had a different way of doing it. So you cannot rule it out with Neanderthals. So it becomes really difficult when you're not.
That importance of detecting freeloaders is kind of resonating with me as well, but that
Yes.
might also be an important part.
Yes, yeah, that's right. I mean, I've actually been writing myself on the evolution of different vices, including selfishness, anger, and some of the other things, and how that connects with theological thinking. The next book I'm doing after that will include gratitude, but it also look at some of those other, we might call more enhanced emotions. So it's considering the blocks, I think, is important before before you even start tackling this. But as I said, we haven't begun yet. We're still trying to frame the pilot project, and we will have several consultations with a range of different scientists and theologians and philosophers to try and see, well, what are the other big questions that we might try and tackle. Maybe yeah.
Firstly, I want to express my gratitude to you for giving the talk. And secondly, you mentioned earlier on what effect gratitude might have on the physical record. And I may have misunderstood. Are you going to, in advance, try and think about how it might have effect on the physical record and then look for that? Or are you going to see, okay, this is how gratitude has affected the physical record, which way around are you looking at?
Okay, I think we're going to be looking at material science rather than necessarily presupposing what it might look like. So we're going to be open to, it's the same with we call the other project I did with Augustine Fuentes, the evolution of wisdom. Now, whether it's wisdom or not, or symbolism, is a moot point really, but something complex was happening in cognitive capacity that allowed those particular groups or individuals to make certain instruments and so on that couldn't have happened unless there was a fairly complex set of interrelationships, and so it was inferred rather than direct. So these are always inferred. So for example, I'll give you an example of what Henry Spikins has done with compassion, which is a little bit more solid perhaps. I mean, it's bound to be fairly speculative, but in that case, you can find bones of individuals that had excessive vitamin A content. And the bones actually showed evidence of this disease, and the disease meant that they were completely incapacitated and had to be looked after by someone else. Now the question is, why on earth did they do that when, basically was hold up their own survival? The only reason must have been because of some kind of compassion was there. So it's things like that. You try and find sort of traces or clues that will imply, rather than necessarily, I mean, you're never going to be 100% sure. It's always to some extent speculative, but it helps to create a narrative that's still backed up by some empirical evidence rather than just speculating out of the blue. And that's what the most you can do, but to ignore it altogether and just stick to the bones and not think about the moral or the emotional or the worlds within which these hominids live, I think is even more distorting as to what may have happened. So each narrative in the future could be challenged or changed, but it's developing it piece by piece, and hopefully you'll say there's never going to be any sudden change. You're going to get this gradual shift. Yes.
Yes, thank you. I agree with Bethany that possibly we need more empirical evidence to assess the relationship between gratitude and religious experience, besides Thomistic wisdom and so on. But my question regards the point 5 in your conclusion list, theology needs not resist evolutionary accounts for etc. etc. So I'm quite concerned about how theology can make place or can benefit from the results of evolutionary study of religion. I'm quite acquainted with this reception and the development, but indeed I think that we have a problem because many of these views are strongly naturalistic attempts to explain how religion not only arose but evolved through the centuries. So there are competing views regarding theological views on history of salvation, doctrinal development, and so on. And as competing paradigms, it's not easy to converge, collaborate, dialogue, because if they are able to provide a quite complete understanding of this evolution, it seems that the theological understanding is a little bit redundant, and we can do without. Or the final problem is that they are displacing theological
Yes.
accounts and
I know.
insights. So if they succeed at explaining religion better than theology, that would be very bad news for us for theologians. We should change job and look somewhere else to gain our life.
Okay, maybe I should have explained that line a little bit better, because you're absolutely right. There are some, and in fact, in a book I wrote called Christ and Evolution, I took apart much evolutionary psychology and tried to expose some of its flaws and also its incompatibility with theology. So I'm not saying that all evolutionary accounts are compatible with theology. I'm saying there are some, such as Augustine Fuentes' account, which it allows theology to exist in a reasonably happy relationship. There are many others where you want to challenge it, and so I think that let's go with those who are, let's support, if you like, the evolutionary accounts which are compatible, as much as attack those that are incompatible, because I think I think Augustine Fuentes would agree with me that attempts to explain the content of religious belief is not convincing. So in other words, there's the scientific doubts about whether they really work. So, and I gave an example from some of Harvey Whitehouse's work where he exposed the problem with this idea of a punishing God. So the alternative explanation for the finding that religious crimes then lead to people having punishing thoughts was that actually they were sensitive to injustice rather than necessarily anything to do with religious sense. So what I'm saying is that let's look at the evidence again and maybe try and think of a different way of thinking about evolutionary explanations of religion that are at least compatible with theology. So it's about making sure that we still have a voice in those discussions rather than discount it. That means taking, religious experience from the inside, as it were, seriously, and not dismissing this idea of encounters, which I've tried to stress out at the beginning, that theologically the relationship with God is an encounter rather than just a product of one's imagination. And I think this is probably where I would diverge as well with Augustine Fuentes. So there's no way that he would ever imply in his work that a direct encounter with God was somehow an evolutionary sound explanatory tool for why religion has emerged. But of course, the idea that it's just a product of one's imagination goes back as early as Feuerbach and some of the other philosophers of religion, that we can just explain religion away through products of our imagination. So I think we have to try we have to agree to differ on that, but there are other aspects where we can work together. So there's certainly areas of incompatibility. I wouldn't want to give the impression that I thought it was all seamless or, there are 10 areas of tension and we have to navigate those. Gosh, how many more questions we have? Oliver,
Yeah, I just wondered, there's another possibility, isn't there? And that is the possibility that there's a profound paradigm shift happening in science, and that sooner or later theology is going to catch up, so the humanistic side is going to catch up. We're still at the early stages, and the changes in scientific understanding of the world and the human are so radical that they almost escape the view. People they obviously outside sort of the line of sight of humanistic type thinkers. But if a paradigm change is going to happen, similar to something that happened 300 or 400 years ago, then you can approach it in a slightly different way. Instead of trying to fit theology into evolution, you can ask whether, let's say, primary evolutionary theory, does that in some way illumine traditional Christian belief, for instance? In making that move, I don't think one's trying to bulwark Christianity and set it apart. What was actually saying is there's a possibility here that this radical paradigm shift, which was probably going to deliver a participatory understanding of the human and the cosmos, quantum is going to be there on the table, that would change all the coordinates and might well mean that a more traditional Christianity, which hadn't jettisoned, before it jettisoned all that stuff that didn't fit the science of the day, that there might be much more of a continuity. And one way you could see it, for instance, is you could use niche construction theory, and you could put together what traditional Christianity held to be the ultimate telos of the person of Jesus, or the body of Jesus, which is to say, being at home in heaven, being at home, as it were, at the very core of the created order. And that's a physical thing. You could then say, well, his body manifests all kinds of tunneling effects and so forth. So if this happened, we don't know if it happened, but if it happened, then you might expect then quantum effects to be present in the body that comes and goes and that kind of thing. And you may also begin to think, well, hang on, if he takes the human body into the centre of the heavenly, which is the centre of the cosmos, we would say that's deep down now, not up there, but deep down within reality, then what would be coming into view is something equivalent of niche construction. In other words, this would be a kind of fulfilment of the principle of niche construction, whereby the human body is taken to the very core, belongs in the universe at its very centre. So, I mean, it's a big question because it looks like an attempt to bulwark traditional Christian belief. I don't think it's that. I think it's a sense, well, change may be coming, and we may be having to think in these kinds of ways outside the Christian context before very long, in which case a different kind of relation might emerge between what everyone believes and everyone experiences in the world that's filtered through, I mean, we're building quantum computers, for heaven's sake, we're trying to do that. Quantum effects are everywhere in this particular world, massive presence of quantum effects everywhere. So, is it worth at least considering that it is paradigm shift that's going to happen, and that therefore these questions about individual things are going to be slightly recontextualized because they're not defensive anymore. It's, as it were, an expression of a deep continuity between scientific thinking and religion, at least up to a certain point, further than has been before. I mean, faith is always faith, but we may be much closer to the harmony between the two in 10, 15 years' time than we have been for a long time.
I think the idea of niche construction is something that I've worked with before in terms of Deane-Drummond. So in other words, there are ways of understanding the theological task which resonate with aspects of niche construction theory, and also, of course, the ecological and the network ideas and the multi-species. These are all, if you like, in the ether, and theology can draw on those as well. But I think the underlying philosophy will always be somewhat different because science works on empirical evidence and theology doesn't, not to the same degree. It draws on those findings in the way that maybe Aquinas did with Aristotle. Now we have a different kind of cosmology that needs to be taken into account. And you say that's moving and shifting. But in addition to that, someone like Thomas Nagel, for example, in his Mind in the Cosmos, it showed that at least some philosophers are starting to think about the possibility of the transcendent, if you like. But you have to ask yourself what kind of transcendence does that imply? Is it the God that we really know, or is it somehow something else? And I don't think I think that's an open question, because I think that form of, you might call transcendent naturalism, is intriguing, but I think it's ambiguous in terms of its fruitfulness for theology. So I don't yet know where I stand on that, because I don't think it's been properly developed or unraveled yet by those who are working in this field, which are trying to push different kinds of philosophy, naturalistic philosophies, which are more open to the transcendent. But it will be interesting to see what happens. And like I said, in terms of something like gratitude, for example, these are moral emotions that are specific to communities as well as individuals. So it's not like it's just individualization or discrete. It could be spread out rather than like the extended mind ideas. So I think it's all. We just do our little piece in a way. We try and think about the big picture, but there's also these other little pieces that we're trying to chip away at and find ways of collaborating, as well as perhaps ways of aligning ourselves with one aspect of the scientific debate rather than others, because there's always going to be a debate within the sciences. And so it's about where we position ourselves as theologians and being self-conscious about that, so being prepared to challenge where it's due, but not challenge in an unnecessary way. So I think the difficulty, as Mary Midgley pointed out in her last testament, as it were, her swan song book on what is philosophy. She makes it quite clear in that book that it's both science and philosophy come from different kinds of standpoints, the different framings of things. So I think we have to sort of be aware of that and what that implies as well. So I'm not giving you a very satisfactory answer. It's too late tonight for me to think about that clearly, but I do think that we have to keep on trying, please.
I remember reading once a rather good book by Adrian Plass, which was situated in a sort of spring harvest-like event where people kept on getting into very good theological discussions in the laundrette or something like that, at which point an organiser would come up and tell them they had to stop because it's time to go on to the next thing. And in the same spirit, I think we probably ought to stop now. It's just about 9:30. Nobody's fallen asleep at all. It's been wonderful. Thank you very much indeed.